Welcome back to another episode of the Electric Election Road Trip. I am your host, Benji Backer, president and founder of the Conservation Coalition, and we are live in Houston, Texas with Dan Crenshaw, the one and only. Dan, welcome to the Electric Election Podcast.
Hey, great to be with you, Benji. I appreciate all the work you guys do.
Well, thank you, sir. And, we're on the heels of a really effective advertisement that you guys just launched about the importance of climate change and the environment to you personally. Can you talk about why you've stepped out on this issue and why it's so important to you?
Sure, because we need rational environmentalism. I think the majority of Americans want some kind of solution for a reduction in carbon emissions, but environmentalism is about a lot more than just reducing carbon emissions. People want clean air, clean water. This is something we naturally care about, conservative or liberal, and I think for a long time Republicans felt like they were on the defense on this. And my point was that this is not necessary to be on the defense. We can be on offense. And here's how this happens. Let me explain the psychology of why Republicans end up on defense. And what I'm about to explain is it's translatable across all issues, not just climate. So here's how it goes. All right, there's a pretty agreeable proposition, okay? In this case, we care about the environment. That's an agreeable proposition.
Right.
And then the left says, this is how you care about the environment. And then they propose the most radical possible both premises and solutions. And then the right says, well, that doesn't make any sense. We're not in favor of that. And then the left says, well, it's because you don't care enough, okay? Does that sound familiar? That's not just true in climate, that's true across all issues. And instead of getting more creative and more aggressive and going on the offense about, no, here, we do care, and here's our solutions, this is how we should talk about it, this is what it means to be a rational problem solver, I think for a long time, Republicans just backed into a corner. And it's just trying to reverse that. I mean, it's something we all care about, so let's have a rational discussion about it and talk about it.
That's exactly right. I mean, we just did a poll that showed that 85% of young conservatives would be more likely to vote for a Republican if they prioritized climate change and a climate change plan. And yet, there aren't a ton of, people who believe that the Republican Party even cares about climate change. It's starting to shift within the House and the Senate on the Republican side. Can you talk a little bit about that progress that you've seen in your time in D.C. and how you hope to see it continue into the future?
Yeah, it shifted a lot. I mean, Leader McCarthy and I and Garrett Graves and others, although the leadership as a whole, we were pushing this really hard, and the coronavirus hit, and let's just not talk about the year 2020.
Yeah.
And everybody was watching Tiger King instead of talking about our new energy frontier, and it was a disaster. But we were pushing this pretty hard. We had a whole 3-phase series with multiple bills, a lot of them bipartisan, real solutions, not like virtue signaling and a Green New Deal and talking about giving people jobs even if they don't want to work and destroying the farting cows. Not a bunch of nonsense and cute video making, although I do like to make cute videos, as you know. But mine have substance, just to be clear. But ours, we had real legislation. Let's talk about being pro-nuclear. Let's talk about the stuff that actually works, and stop talking about the stuff that is proven not to work. Okay, so what does work? How about exporting more natural gas? How about building pipelines, which is the safest way to actually transfer something like natural gas? What is responsible for reducing carbon emissions in the United States back to 1990 levels? Fracking, natural gas. Let's talk about nuclear. All right, and let's talk about an all of the above energy strategy. One of those bills is plant 1 trillion trees, right? But it's not just like, hey, let's have a government program that plants 1 trillion trees. No, it's getting the private sector involved because people want to help, right? It's collective action as opposed to activism. You taught me that. I don't know. Well, I'm going to give you credit for that little line I just used. The action versus activism. Prior to COVID-19, and we just have to admit that our priorities changed a little bit, at least in the public discourse, as far as what voters are looking at these days. But we've still been working on these policies. I've actually passed 5 bills, which is difficult as a freshman in the minority. Okay. And one of those bills is the Leading Act, which is a carbon capture solutions, but it basically repurposes some money at Department of Energy to do more research and development on carbon capture technology for the natural gas space, which is, again, proven to work. It's a place right outside Houston where we're at right now. And it's called, the name escapes me all of a sudden, Net Power. And basically they take in natural gas, create electricity from it, but through some process they have recaptured that CO2 of net zero emissions, power about 5,000 homes as a result. So we should be talking about how to scale that kind of technology out. That's really fascinating stuff. There's so much more that people are working on. How do you utilize carbon? Should it really be a waste product? Should we even think of it as a waste product? You're breathing it out right now. You know, it can be utilized, right? It can be a commodity. And once something is thought of as a commodity, you can trade it, you can sell it, you can store it, and you can utilize it, right? So these things make a lot more sense as opposed to, I think, a lot of the solutions that have long been popularized that either don't work or actually harm the environment worse.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the problems is that the environment is something that we all care about, but we've made the solutions something that are way more simple than they actually are. A lot of folks on the left talk about, how simple these solutions are. We can change all this overnight, and we can, have a completely 100% renewable economy by tomorrow, when that's not the reality. And that doesn't mean that you can't take steps in the right direction. Can you speak to the importance of kind of that incremental, steps in the right direction, one small step and then a larger step, and keeping on that path instead of assuming that we can wait for some holy grail policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's science fiction, right? I mean, that's what you're describing. It's science fiction utopianism, and it's not, and the irony of the science fiction is that it's not based in science. At least science fiction is usually based in science. But what they're saying often is not, right? They're not talking about energy density. They're not talking about, okay, how many acres of land do you have to plow down? How many species have to be destroyed? How many migratory birds, endangered migratory birds, have to be destroyed? How many wind turbines do you have to import from China, which you need fossil fuels to build in order to get here? I'm not saying these things aren't part of the solution, but we have to have a rational discussion about it. It makes sense.
There are trade-offs to all energy sources, and no one admits that.
Trade-offs. This is a very important word that is never talked about, again, across all issues, by the way, because there aren't solutions, there are trade-offs. And rational discussions about trade-offs is what governing officials' job is, fundamentally. And I think Americans should start demanding that of their elected officials. No, tell me the trade-offs. Don't just tell me what you want. Any child can tell me what they want, right? I want to know how you're going to get there and what the trade-offs are. That's a rational discussion. And that's the rational discussion surrounding all clean energy. And we need to go back to, like, the 60,000 foot level sometimes too. If we just got rid of the Texas energy sector all of a sudden, right? Just kept everything in the ground, no more fossil fuels. There's a lot of people who would say, and if I polled everybody, would it reduce worldwide emissions? Everybody would say yes, of course. I'm not so sure that's true. Okay, here's why. Because it's not like energy demand just disappears, all right? And just based on the physics of what we currently have and the way wind and solar works, you're not going to meet that demand. Now, if you all of a sudden built a bunch of nuclear power plants, maybe you could, but we're not going to all of a sudden build a bunch of nuclear power plants, so that's kind of off the table. And the reality is that over the next 25 years, energy demand around the world is going to increase by about 25 to 30%. Okay, and it's immoral to tell a bunch of poor people in developing countries that they can't thrive, that they can't prosper, that they can't build out their lives. Okay, we're not going to tell them that. Even if we wanted to tell them that, it's not going to happen. So who's going to provide that energy? Well, it's Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and who produces energy in a dirtier way? They do, right? And the EPA estimates that Russian natural gas on a lifetime cycle basis produces 47% more carbon emissions than U.S. natural gas. So at a very practical level, just looking at the facts, we probably increase carbon emissions by destroying the U.S. energy sector. So that's a pretty big deal when we're talking about, like you said, the oversimplification of this entire debate. You have to bring everybody to the table, and as it turns out, the more we innovate, the more those innovations get exported. The cleaner we innovate, and the more we can export that around the world. And so just innovating our way to a cleaner future, I think, which is why, again, I propose something like the Leading Act, the New Energy Frontier, because innovation always has been proven throughout history to get us to a cleaner future, so why not rely on that same strategy?
Well, that innovation-based approach is what needs to happen on climate, and that is something that, again, will not happen overnight, but it also helps solve the problem globally because we can export that innovation to other countries.
Right.
Unfortunately, to a point you made earlier, a lot of the wind power and solar power in the United States gets exported from China and imported by the United States, and it ends up having a very negative environmental impact and trade-offs. Something that was shocking to me as we toured the country, as we're kind of in the home stretch, is that we visited 2 wind and solar facilities in different parts of the country, one in the Midwest, one in the Northeast, that were run by conservative-leaning folks. And they, were frustrated with the lack of investment in their energy sources from our country and how they had to rely on people overseas. But they also were kind of frustrated by the lack of dialogue within their own party on renewables. You and I both agree that we need to have better technology, better storage. It's not scalable to an entire country, wind and solar, overnight. What can Republicans and conservatives do to take the renewable conversation into our own hands while also supporting these other energy sources and really focus on improving renewable energy sources, knowing that they're not at the scale that they need to be yet?
They're not. I mean, listen, I think solar and wind, it's going to work where it works. Okay. If we're going to invest in something, though, I'm more inclined to invest in something like nuclear. Mm-hmm. Right. I'm more inclined to invest in something that is very clearly a reliable source of energy, takes up an acre of land as opposed to thousands of acres of land, and has an overhead cost, but we can mine that here. We can dispose of it here. There's been a lot of falsehoods put out about nuclear,
right,
about the environmental damage. So, listen, I am for all of the above, but I want everybody to compete. I prefer technology neutral tax credit, for instance, as opposed to just favoring solar and wind. It is not obvious. Solar and wind have been getting favored for a long, long time, and it's not obvious that it's that it's going to somehow get better in the future, just because we decide to. And so, I do think neutrality of technology is still the right approach. But if we're going to push our investment to something, all the science tells me that nuclear is a good investment.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's where conservatives can really start to own the issue, is talking about the potential for nuclear energy, and in communities that need it most. I mean, we talked with TerraPower, Bill Gates' company, earlier on the trip, and they were talking about the number one reason they support nuclear is actually not climate change. It's actually in lowering emissions. It's actually empowering people in developing countries to have, cheaper energy, more affordable energy. And then on top of that, there's obviously an immense benefit on the environment. And that for both of those reasons, they're prioritizing the development of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is expensive at this point, and there's a lot of regulatory streamlining that we could probably do to accelerate that process. What misconceptions do you think people need to understand differently about when it comes to nuclear energy?
Well, I think everybody imagines like this green ooze coming out every time there's a nuclear power plant, and radioactive birds with 2 heads and things, and this just isn't true. We need to do away with these misconceptions. I think nuclear disposal and facility, it looks like some boring metal rods being stored underground. I mean, that's what it is. It's not what people think it is. It can be done safely. I mean, come on, guys. We put a nuclear reactor in a tight enclosed space with hundreds of men and women on a submarine 1,000 feet below the surface. Like, that's pretty dangerous, but we've been doing it for decades. There's ways to miniaturize nuclear, make it safe and efficient, last forever. I mean, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of nuclear. I've probably become a bigger, as I've delved into this subject a lot more over the last year. I've probably become more pro. If we're going to invest, again, if we're going to use taxpayer dollars somewhere and invest in something, it should be R&D along things that are proven to work. Like, again, let's look at case studies. France and Germany. Germany did their own kind of Green New Deal. They pushed entirely towards wind and solar, $580 billion worth. France invests in nuclear. and who's actually achieved per capita emission reductions? France. Germany's actually increased, and then they end up importing more Russian natural gas. Another dirty little secret is they add, I think, let me make sure I get this right. They add basically wood burning to the mix. They call that renewable, but wood burning releases more carbon than coal does. So, like, this is, people are virtue signaling and hurting the environment and pretending like they're helping. I mean, it's so, again, we all have to take a step back and just think about what's actually working.
So we have allowed that, I think, as conservatives, a lot of time to happen. I mean, we've kind of let that issue be taken in the wrong direction because we haven't leaned in on it. What in October of 2020, what can conservatives do better to take the reins on this issue?
It's actually really easy. I mean, I think just point out, one, we care. People just want to know we care. Okay, so that's number one, that we care and we have better solutions. Americans aren't willing to make the trade-offs of the Green New Deal. Once Americans understand what's at stake there, how many jobs are at stake, what happens to your electricity prices, what happens to your economy, what happens to your ability to power your economy, people take a step back and they say, well, I'm not really willing to make that trade-off. So we have to have an honest discussion about climate change. All right, and let's just take the IPCC data. The Democrats always twist that data. They always try to fear-monger and make people
Well, the worst
believe.
case scenario.
They always perpetuate the worst case scenario. So we have to talk about a few things: adaptation and reasonable, rational discussions on how to reduce carbon emissions, focusing on what has worked. Again, exporting more natural gas, more technological innovation, more nuclear, more of an all of the above energy strategy, continuing to invest in research, in battery power, in solar. Solar's a bit more promising, it seems, than something like wind. But, you know, and then having a rational discussion about where those energy production sources should be, where they can work and where they don't work. You know, it's
right, different energy sources work in different parts of the country,
right.
And that's why, I mean, that's what we've seen in Seattle, Washington, where I usually live. It's hydropower,
mm-hmm.
But hydropower is not going to work in the middle of the
Sure.
Texas desert. So there are different solutions for different parts of the country.
There's some fascinating things happening around geothermal too. Geothermal was previously designated only for places where the geology works for that. But I just met with some folks who were using some really interesting technology and exploring some ways to basically make it, I can't even explain it, so I'm not going to try, but in a way that it could work anywhere. So there's just some really fascinating innovations that we should be pushing for that are totally clean. And something like geothermal, by the way, still uses the same workers, the same industries, the oil and gas market. So even if we do transition, you actually are hiring the same people, as opposed to when the Democrats say, well, we'll just retrain people. They'll just have a new job. It'll be like magic. Like, that's not how life works. It's a very disingenuous talking point. But something like geothermal, you really are using the same kind of service industries.
Well, one of the really inspiring things about this trip so far has been we've talked to Republican and Democratic elected officials. Obviously, we are a conservative group, but there have been some really exciting efforts that are being done by people like Dean Phillips and Senator Coons, and we don't see eye to eye on everything. But at the end of the day, like, younger generations see this issue as climate change. They don't see it as red or blue. What do you think the potential for bipartisanship, if both sides can kind of get their act together on it, is on climate change?
I think all the solutions I've mentioned are bipartisan. Again, when we were pushing this, when McCarthy was pushing this earlier in the year, I believe probably most of those bills that we compiled into these larger plans were bipartisan. So it's really not that hard to get there. Where you run into trouble is the left is growing increasingly dogmatic about it has to be solar and wind, and we can't have a conversation until we agree that all the fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. That's a non-starter. Okay, that tells me that it's more religious than it is policy making, and then as opposed to problem solving, right? It's more dogmatic, and so. That's the danger, right? And that's been around for a while, and it's gotten a lot stronger. But there's still plenty of people like Dean, for instance, that are willing to keep getting on these bipartisan bills. And there's no reason that they can't pass. The frustrating thing is, and this is always what happens in Congress, and it'll continue to happen in Congress, is we get a bunch of good bipartisan bills. let's say 80% of something in a larger bill, like the clean energy bill that was just passed, will be good stuff that we all agree on, and then they tack on a bunch of things that we can't possibly support, and then it goes nowhere. This is frustrating to Americans. This happens all the time. It's been especially frustrating in the era of coronavirus for totally different reasons outside of climate. But when small businesses need extra funding, they can't get it. So
right.
Those kind of games always happen in Congress, or at least they have in my short time with Pelosi in charge. And it's got to stop. We should be able to just say, all right, fine, we can't agree on all this stuff. Let's just go ahead and vote on the things that we know we do agree on and make some progress.
Well, and I think that the inability for Congress to try to find overlap and then not tack other things on to kill it is a huge problem right now.
Yeah.
And you have Americans who feel left behind because even though we're getting really close to decisions that could help them and help catalyze the decisions on fighting climate change, we're being held back by partisan politics where it's we've got some clean energy ramifications of this package, let's add on something different, and then it totally kills the whole thing, and then you have people who are relying on that investment that are completely left behind. And that's we've been traveling the country also seeing that the vast majority of Americans do feel left behind. They feel like they aren't heard, especially in rural communities, and they feel like it's dictated by social media. And it was really interesting. I was reading before we started talking here. The executive producer of this podcast, Saul Spady, wrote an article 2 years ago talking about how you could be the next kind of the conservative AOC and lead us in a better direction on the right of center side. You've really kind of become that voice, and you've really embraced kind of the future of the conservative movement through a pragmatic perspective on issues like climate change. We've also run into a lot of people across the country who feel like elected officials are so focused on the media and the Twitter and Instagram, and that's what we're focused on a lot of the time too, that they're not actually being heard as constituents. How, as you kind of look to your future, how are you going to prioritize relying on constituent voices to further issues like climate change, where for the left it's how many trillions of dollars can we spend and throw money at the problem and then get retweets off of my plan's the most expensive? How can we get away from that mindset of sound bites while also getting attention and listening to our constituents?
So let me kind of unpack what you're saying. You're saying you feel like, or people in rural areas especially, feel like the conversation just goes past them. Yep. Because it's just it's talking points being fought on social media. I mean, we're not getting away from social media,
right?
Unless social media becomes so censorious that they that's a whole different problem that we're about to run into. But we're not getting away from it. It's how we communicate. Right. I'm not sure how else. I'm not sure how else my voice even reaches a person if they're not following me on social media. It's why we do it. So that's not going to stop. I understand that it can give you a headache. But
let's just say
it's up to our leaders to have more substantive conversations on social media. I think that's what frustrates them. I don't think it's the use of social media.
Yeah.
I think it's the virtue signaling and the finger pointing, which is why we do what we do. I do a podcast so that we go into a lot more depth, right? And it's not me just pontificating on a subject. I mean, I could do that, but I'm bringing in an expert.
Right.
We've had a lot of different experts on this particular issue. I've probably had almost 10 podcasts at this point on something related to the environment or energy sources, whatever it is. Fascinating discussions. Because the goal is to inform people, and if we do videos, we're hitting a certain point. We're telling you why we think what we think. And I'm going to directly confront the ideas of my opponents instead of just talking past them.
Yeah.
I think that's what Americans are sick of, is talking past each other, like you're playing tennis in two different tennis courts. Because one side's like, I have the best solution, and they're like, well, their solution's bad, but my solution's good. And everybody listening is like, okay, but why? Why is your solution better? Why can't you just answer the simple question? And the reality is oftentimes politicians don't even know, because they haven't really done that. They're moving from subject to subject, and it's just what's the talk? That's the talking point. Okay, I'll repeat it.
They're afraid of debate a lot of time in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I tell you what, the left should be afraid of this debate because they've got all the science wrong, they've got all the engineering wrong, and they basically don't even talk about the engineering, which is a lot of the things we've been talking about throughout the last hour, right? Energy density issues, space, time, cost, trade-offs, right? These things matter quite a bit when you're talking about solutions, and so we've just got to lean into it more.
I agree, and I think as we look to 2022 and 2024, we need to have a stake on this issue as a national party. And as a young conservative, I was very disappointed in the fact that we didn't talk about it at the national convention, and that it's struggling to be an issue in the national party when there are people like you and Kevin McCarthy and Garrett Graves and Elise Stefanik and Mike Gallagher all working on this for the next generation of the conservative movement. To me, and I'm not going to say this for you, to me it feels like your work's being overshadowed. And we need to have a larger stance on this issue if we hope to have a conservative movement in the future, because our ideas do work. Yep. They will work. These issues are complex, they're not simple, and people need to know about that. And they need to know about market-based ways, innovation, technologically based ways to solve climate change. And if they don't, and they don't have these conversations, and they don't hear these conversations, and they don't hear the podcasts that you're on just because you have an R next to your name, then it's going to be really hard. And I think as a young person, that politicization of the issue has been damaging to my generation, as I see them, voting based on this issue, only believing that one side has a voice. It's hard when the national party necessarily isn't engaged in the way that they should be, and I think that that's where we can do a lot better. My final question is, we've got 10 days left of this road trip, and we've learned a lot, we've seen a lot. There are a lot of young conservatives who follow ACC, and they're really excited about having a voice as a young person who believes in these sort of mechanisms. If you could tell a young person, liberal, independent, or conservative, how to make a difference on this issue and actually have their voice heard, what would you tell them?
Well, get involved with ACC, it sounds like. Volunteer.
I love that.
Somewhere. Get involved with ACC. What do you guys do? You guys take donations, take some money. I get asked that question all the time. How do I get involved, whether it's with, climate issues or any other kind of policy, whatever makes you happy. I mean, debate in class. Like, do your research before going in there and have that conversation in class. It can be thrilling or it can be devastating. Either way, you'll learn a lot. And maybe you'll change some minds. So, start a group, right? I mean, this is what America's all about. People start groups, they fundraise, they activate, they hopefully get really well informed, and try to make a change. And there's just so many ways, and it's going to be different for everybody. I don't know if that was a satisfying answer or not, but
but it speaks to the fact that, like, for an organization like ours, we're focused on action over activism a lot of the times. You need to have activism, but you also need to have action. We need more people who are meeting with their elected officials. We've obviously done that with you, and we need more people writing op-eds. We need more people getting out there and voting. We need people to actually engage in the political process in a respectful way if we're hopeful for action. Yeah. And action starts with each individual person, and I think our generation sometimes tries to wait for the action instead of actually being part of it.
Or, like you said, do a lot of activism, right? It's easy to do, some kind of flash mob in a town square, like we're fighting climate change. Like, it doesn't do anything, right? And it just adds to the confusion. The goal, what I appreciate about you guys, is your goal appears to be to create clarity out of the chaos of this debate, as opposed to adding more chaos. And so, what can people do? I think engage constructively, right? Engage with a rational skepticism, and engage with rational thought. We have a lot of that lacking. We have a lot of passion and emotions in our society these days, especially amongst our youth, with very little sophistication. In fact, we've elevated passion above sophistication, and that's a real problem. I write about that in my book. I'll just give a plug for my book.
And tell everyone the name of it.
Fortitude,
and they can find it pretty much everywhere.
American Resilience in the Era of Outrage, and I point out this is a problem. Right? We've stopped engaging in reason and rational, thoughtful discourse, and instead elevated emotional discourse above that, and it's very damaging to important issues. And climate change is, as you know, is very, very emotional for a lot of people. I mean, we're scaring children. Children feel higher higher degrees of anxiety than ever before, and they'll cite climate change. So there's clearly adults are scaring them into depression and into anxiety, and this is not necessary.
And that's what we've been telling young people, is that you should be impatient but hopeful. You should be impatient for action, you should demand action, you should be a part of the action, but you should also have hope. Yeah. We could talk about this for hours. You and I see eye to eye on a lot of this stuff. I'm really appreciative of the way that you've embraced nuclear and kind of this common sense approach to the energy frontier that we can have as a country, the new energy frontier. And I hope that next year and maybe post-COVID, we can bring that back up into our political discourse. Thank you for joining the Electric Election Road Trip and Podcast, and thank you for being an ally for conservative climate change policy, because we need more people in the movement to do that. You're helping lead that charge, and it is so, so appreciated. I want to thank Dan Crenshaw for joining the Electric Election Road Trip, and to our viewers, we will be back with you in Austin, Texas for the next episode of the Electric Election Road Trip.